Your brain's job isn't to make you a great leader or a great runner. Your brain's job is to keep you safe. And so to keep us safe, our brain will tell us lots of things that feel unhelpful towards performance, but are actually done in mind of keeping us within our comfort zone. Find the thing that is for you. And when you find your thing, it brings you so much joy and it helps you realize you can set great goals. It helps you figure stuff out.
Hello and welcome to Run the Business, the podcast that explores the place where running and leadership come together. We'll find out how running might help us with leading, managing people, and generally being better in business. We'll also try and answer that question, do runners make better leaders? I'm Anthony Gay, and today's episode is a little different to our usual format as we're going to dive into a specific area of performance, and that's the psychology of high performance, whether that's in business or in running. And I'm really grateful to be speaking to someone who is an expert in this space. She's a chartered sports psychologist who works across multiple sports, including running, with everyone from novices to world champions. Now, as well as coaching athletes, she also helps anyone wanting to aim higher, whether that's on stage, in medicine, law, or leadership. Dr. Josephine Perry, welcome to Run the Business.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Josie, how are you today?
I am good, thank you. I'm back to running. I've been off for 6 weeks with a broken toe and I'm allowed to run again. So I've got all that good buzziness of a good run in my body.
Fantastic, because that was one of the questions that we start with is, when did you last go running? And I know you've done all sorts of different sort of sporting things over your career and cycling and Ironman and swimming and stuff like that. So how big a part of your life is running?
Far too big a part of my life. I've really missed it these last 6 weeks. I can swim and I can cycle and I do lots of stuff with my daughter, but I think we all have a sport that deep down does something to us. It's that thing that even if we find something else, we tend to go back to it. We leave a little bit of our heart with that sport. And I don't know why, but for me, that's running.
And tell me about that turning point in your career, which was when you became aware of performance and how we think about how we perform. Because you used to compete in Ironman competitions, didn't you?
Yes. Yeah. So until I had my daughter, I did Ironman racing and I call it like my grown-up career. So I worked in the city. I was a communications director. I sat on kind of executive boards with what felt like a very full-on grown-up job. And I went over to Melbourne to do the Melbourne Ironman. And we were standing on the beach in Frankston and the waves were terrifying. Like, my husband's Australian, used to that stuff. Even he was pretty scared. And I'd done all my training in like London swimming pools. So I really wasn't prepared for this. And yet I stood on the beach and I overheard the commentator saying, you cannot control those waves. You can only control how you feel about them. And it was a proper light bulb moment of like, oh yeah, if I choose to think differently about those waves, I might be able to handle it. And I did. And I got in. Goodness knows where I got out of the water at the end of that swim. But it was a brilliant day out there. I got my fastest Ironman time. I think it was 10:59. And it really made me think, how do I do my sport a bit differently? I don't have any talent in sport at all. I don't have the genes for it. But I do love it. And it kind of made me realize if I used my brain, I could actually be a better athlete. So I ended up really researching sports psychology. There weren't that many books around at the time, but I read the ones that were. And I ended up leaving my job, going back to university to study general psychology. And then after a year, I could switch into sports psychology.
You mentioned something there, which I just want to pick up on. I speak to a lot of people who think they have this imposter syndrome. They don't feel like they've got the skills or the experience to be in a particular position, whether that's leading in business or maybe even standing on the start line of a race. How did you view that, and how did you sort of start to get your head around that? Where does confidence come from? How do we make it?
So I worry about the people that don't have imposter syndrome. I did a Twitter poll a few years ago hundreds and hundreds of replies. And it was something like 91% of us have felt imposter syndrome at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of think that that's pretty good. If you don't have any worries about whether you're doing the right thing, if you're overconfident, you don't do the little things that matter to make a difference and to actually be really good. I remember interviewing for a research project a few years ago, a rower who said, I have never sat on the start line and not known that I was going to win the race. And I was able to look through their kind of now Palmaris and point off, but you didn't win that one. The Australians beat you. And they were like, yeah, but I still knew I was going to win. And that kind of makes me worry a bit more that if you've got no doubts whatsoever, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to not look for those little bits of extra work that we could do. We're not going to put the extra effort in. So I don't worry when people have imposter syndrome. I think it means you've got pretty good, but you can actually just see how much more there is to do.
Because some people have and again, you'd be able to sort of talk to this of an innate talent, but if that talent isn't nurtured and isn't coached and brought along, then it's wasted, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, that innate talent is one of our sources of confidence, but we actually have 12 sources of confidence that we can draw upon. And these work just as well in sport as well as in business. So the two most robust sources of confidence are being really, really well prepared for what you're about to do. If you're about to go into a business meeting and present a pitch, if you have quick flick through the slides and that's all you've done, you're not going to feel confident. Whereas if you've done a couple of run-throughs of it, you've got the stats to back it up, you'll feel much, much more confident and much better able to present it. And the other source of confidence is having evidence that you've done things before. And that's really important because the first time we do anything, it's really scary. And it's the reason people like British Olympic Association would take younger athletes along to earlier games so that they can really get experience of a game's setup and how things work. And it's why we often try in sport to replicate certain things. It's unlikely a coach would make you just go off and do your first marathon without having done a half marathon first or some 10Ks to get that feeling of what it's like to be on the start line or how to take a gel mid-race. So the two most robust sources of confidence, really, really preparing well and having evidence you have done things before, and purposely collecting that evidence. Our brains are not designed to be great runners or great leaders. Our brains are designed purely for survival. And so they will do everything they can to keep us focused on survival. And one of those things is helping us remember all the bad stuff that happens. Every time we've messed up, every time something's gone wrong, our brains are particularly good at remembering those for us.
Yeah.
And so keeping evidence of when we've done things well and being able to look back through that evidence is really important.
Absolutely. And this podcast obviously is all about the relationship between running and business. What's your perspective on this? Because you've worked with very successful people in sport and very successful people in business as well. And what are the traits that you see in people who do well in those areas?
Oh, very helpfully, I've written a book about this. It's called The 10 Pillars of Success. And it was prompted by noticing things that highly successful people have in common. And then I really delved into all the research to see whether that was actually backed up by research. And so it comes out with those kind of 10 pillars. We've got, I have to remember them now, we've got belonging and feeling like you really have a sense of belonging to the community that you're in. We've got mastery, that knowing you can do something really, really well. Then there is autonomy, having a choice and a voice over how you do things. And I think that's really important to being a good leader, because when you give other people the opportunity to direct the way that they do things rather than kind of telling them how to do things, we see far better work coming out and we see far greater kind of ownership of what people do. Then we have purpose. Love that as a subject, that we really understand why we are doing something in the bigger picture that it feeds into. Then, as you mentioned earlier, we've got confidence. We've got process over outcome, really focusing on doing the small things, all those tasks really well. Because when we focus on outcomes, we tend to be it tends to be quite threatening. If we're desperately trying to achieve something, there's always a risk we won't. And that sets off like a threat system within our body, and we find it much harder to perform well at that moment. Mm-hmm. Then we have courage. I loved writing that chapter. I got to interview a guy called Bobby Holland Hanton, who's a stuntman. He does James Bond and Thor and Extraction. And his way of talking about courage and how any of us can build it is fascinating. And then we've got optimism. And there's some brilliant research behind why optimism is so important for us. We have got internal insight. And I got to interview Sarah Pascoe, the comedian, for Internal Insight. Yeah. And she was amazing. I think she should be a psychologist, a leader. She had such brilliant insights that she'd gathered through her comedy career that we could all learn brilliant stuff from. Mm-hmm. And then finally is gratitude. And Lucy Gossage was my interviewee for that. Triathletes might recognise her name. She took 2 years off her career to become a professional triathlete. She's done brilliantly. She's won Ironman Wales many, many times. But she's actually an oncologist. And so her reflections about being an athlete and being an oncologist were absolutely fascinating. And she uses gratitude a lot to be grateful for the life that she's been able to live. Mm-hmm. So I often work with my athletes, with my leaders, on how can we bring in more of those pillars to what they're doing. And it doesn't have to be onerous. It can be writing down a gratitude each day, something that you are grateful for. But we know that helps you feel better. We know that helps you perform better. So they can be quite simple things, but they help grow those characteristics within you.
Thank you for sharing the pillars there and explaining those. So much to pick up on, so many things that I kind of want to ask you and talk about. One of the pillars you mentioned was belonging, sense of belonging. Running is an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's got such a community spirit around running clubs, running events, the running community, and I'm sure you felt it in Ironman as well. Sometimes we don't feel like we can get that at work. You know, the way I spoke to somebody the other day and they said, I've never met a bad runner, or I've never met a runner I don't like.
Oh,
and it's an interesting one that the running community just takes us to a place of safety, of security, of belonging. Have you noticed that in the work that you've done?
Yes. But sometimes I think we need to hunt for it. It doesn't always just come to us. Okay. So the interviewee for that chapter was Dame Kelly Holmes. And obviously she's gone as far as you could go in running.
Yeah.
But she was fascinating in that she talked really deeply and honestly about when she was training for the Olympics. She shared a coach with another runner, and that athlete was from a different country, and she didn't feel like she belonged. And she talked very openly about how she self-harmed during that period because she just felt so lonely, and she felt like she didn't have a team around her to be there for her. And she switched and she moved to sitting within the GB camp and finding that team and training with others. And she did brilliantly. That was the year that she then got her 2 Olympic gold medals. And so she has spent the rest of her career since trying to build belonging for other people. And so all of the projects she does, when she did On Camp with Kelly, it was about getting groups of girls together who felt like they belonged as runners. And when she does Military in Motion, it's about bringing groups together so that they're not exercising on their own, even if it's virtually. They're feeling part of something bigger, and belonging is key to motivation. There's a really lovely motivational theory called self-determination theory that says we basically have 3 types of motivation. A motivation, cannot be bothered to do it. Extrinsic motivation, where we might run for the money, or if we're good, or for the medals, or for the other people, or for the fitness, or for the fact it means we can eat less healthily sometimes. So we have all these other reasons that we do it, external reasons. But the holy grail is intrinsic motivation, where we run because we love it. We have that feeling, we just get carried away. We can find flow fairly easily, and we just love the feeling of running. We would do it even if there were no races. And the way to get intrinsic motivation and to boost it is to have belonging, mastery, and autonomy. And so where someone is missing out on those elements in some way, that's what will work very specifically on. How do you increase your belonging? How do you feel more masterful or more competent at what you do? And how do you have more ownership of your sport?
Mm-hmm. And when the stakes are higher, does that get harder when there's more on the line? When we're talking Olympic gold medals and things like that, does it change?
It gets much harder to stay focused on the important elements, because everybody's talking about it. Everyone's asking you about it. It's everywhere. You can't escape it. And yet, the more important it feels, the harder it then is to achieve it, because your threat systems switch on. And when our threat systems switch on, most runners will remember this one. Before a race, often people will get a bit of a dodgy tummy. Mm-hmm. In some sports, I've seen people throwing up, but lots of people will be on the toilet before they go race. You only have to look at kind of the helicopter videos of London Marathon to see all those queues of people. Yeah. So yeah, our tummy goes bad usually if we're really nervous, we're feeling under threat for some reason. Our heart rate and our breathing rate go up. And we absolutely do not want that in running when we're about to do that for ourselves. We want it to be nice and calm beforehand. We get tight back and shoulder muscles, which that's not so harmful to our running. It's worse in other sports like tennis or snooker or golf. And the final thing is we tend to lose some of our peripheral vision, which if you're doing a road race, it's probably not that big a deal. You can still focus in front of you. You don't really need your hearing that much. But if you're doing an off-road trail race where people might be coming from different sides, or you've got to be looking out for tree roots or uneven ground or really bad weather coming, that is a bit more difficult. So the last thing we want to do is feel under threat. And yet the more we want something, the more everyone around us gives us those expectations. Even when people tell us, oh, you'll be brilliant, you always do great. We think we're being helpful. The runner, the leader, translates that as, you are expecting me to do well, and now I've got threat. So the more we can actually move away from feeling like we have to be brilliant, or we have to do something in a certain way, or there's a really big deal if we mess this up, the harder we make it for ourselves. So we do try to focus people on that intrinsic side more. How do you do this because you love it? How do you focus on tasks and individual processes, not on what the outcome might mean?
Mm. And if you're a leader listening to this and thinking about how you interact with the people around you and your teams, how does that relate to that relationship? What advice would you give to somebody to not put that pressure on a team member, but to give them the freedom to succeed?
I think that comes down to really focusing with the team on, you do need to start with the outcome. What is that outcome that we need? Is it that we need to make X amount more in sales? Or is it that we need 6 more people who are brilliant to join our team? So you are going to have some outcomes. But instead of then telling someone how to do it, you give them the outcome, and it becomes their job to figure out how to do it. I had a story in the book, one of my own stories, that when I ran a team, I used to be very dictatorial around how to do things because I'd done every job in the team. I'd worked my way up. I knew how to do them all. I knew what worked. I knew the shortcuts. And so I used to tell people how to do things. And it's only when I trained in psychology and I kind of ended up with my head in my hands going, what was I doing? That I took away their autonomy. I didn't give them the opportunity to figure it out for themselves. We learn from mistakes. We don't learn by someone telling us what to do. And we put so much more of ourselves into something when we have decided how we do it, when we've got that ownership of the processes. And so if I was to ever be in that situation again, I would do it very, very differently. And it would be, okay, this is our joint goal. It's yours. You go and figure out how to do it. I'm here to help. I'm here with advice. Always happy to listen, but it's yours. Go and see what you can do with it. And people take that as a really great challenge.
It feels like there's a lot of bad things, and I say that, I guess, in air quotes, going on in the world at the moment. And one of the things you talk about is optimism in the 10 pillars. How do we protect ourselves from negativity so we don't end up in a downward spiral and taking everybody's problems on our shoulders? Or what's your take on that?
It's a tough one, isn't it? About 75% of people have optimism as their driver. So actually, even though things feel very bad, a majority of people have that optimism. And we don't want toxic positivity. We don't want to be forcing really happy, nice thoughts on top of everything, because we do need some realism. We need to be pragmatic. The process I tend to use with people, I call it the BRAVE process, and neatly it spells out brave. So B is for being aware. Be aware of those thoughts you've got. Be aware of the things that are coming into your head, telling you, I can't do this. We don't want to try and squash them out, get rid of them. Because if the listeners to this try not to think about pink elephants, you could go, don't think about the pink elephant, don't think about the pink elephant. I can guarantee everyone's now got a troop of pink elephants, I don't know, stomping through their brains.
Absolutely.
So when we try not to think of things, when we try and block them out, they still pop up. It's just annoying.
Yeah.
So the approach that I take, and many other kind of performance psychologists now take, is much more about accept that we're going to have some of those unhelpful thoughts. The R in brave comes from reassign them. Reassign them to little characters. Notice why they are saying what they're saying. Because your brain's job isn't to make you a great leader or great runner. Your brain's job is to keep you safe. And so to keep us safe, our brain will tell us lots of things that feel unhelpful towards performance, but are actually done in mind of keeping us within our comfort zone. And so a lot of leaders have things like perfectionism as kind of a key driver. And so we might make one of those characters that they reassign Peter Perfect. Oh, look, here comes Peter Perfect telling me I must do this perfectly. And it takes some of that kind of personalization out of it. It's not that I must be perfect. It's Peter Perfect is telling me what I need to do right now. So we get some distance, we get some separation, and we can have those little characters in our head that we reassign things to. And then the A is for advocate for ourselves. So we don't just sit there and let those voices tell us that we're rubbish or we need to be perfect, but we actually start to give ourselves that evidence. It's boosting our confidence. So I know Peter Perfect's telling me I need to be perfect, but actually I've done really well. I've hit my targets. I've recruited somebody that's brilliant, and my team seem really happy at the moment. So I think we're doing okay. So you start to advocate for yourself. The V stands for values. And not company values. I don't believe in company values. I think values have to be super, super personal. And if you understand what drives you and what really matters to you and how can you be more value-based in what you do, you will do good things. And it becomes a really nice way of starting to answer that character. I know Peter wants me to be perfect, but everything seems to be going okay right now. And actually, one of my values is gratitude. And so I'm going to be grateful for what I've got right now rather than beating myself up for everything that I haven't yet done and is still on my to-do list. And then the E is for engaging your plan. Not thinking about the big outcome, but what's the first thing I need to do to be better? Right, I'm going to have a quick check-in with my team and make sure they're all doing okay. And it becomes a really nice process, whether you're struggling in a race, whether you're super nervous beforehand, or whether you feel like you're not doing so well at work or you've got some of that imposter syndrome. It's about being aware, reassigning, advocating for yourself, noting your values and engaging a plan. And you can do anything when you've got that in place.
That's fantastic. And again, thank you for sharing that, because that makes so much sense. One thing you touched upon there was values and personal values company values, something that, don't work for you. Something that I see a lot in business is these days is purpose.
Yeah.
And I think Simon Sinek, wasn't it, that really sort of brought a lot of this to the front a few years back around, having a goal, having a why, having a purpose. How do you think individuals and companies can sort of balance those two things? Do you think it's possible, or do you think you have to start with the individual?
I love companies having a why, because you can all buy into a why. Why are we doing this? And I love Simon Sinek's book. I recommend it all of the time because it's got some brilliant ways of understanding why companies would do things and how you can all be driven by them, and how it gives you a much wider remit to go off and do things that still fit within that why. So they can be very liberating, but it's very hard to get yours, whether you're a company or you're an individual. Finding that purpose, I think, it takes a long time. It's a really tricky one. I've only ever had one person in my years of doing this who knew instantly what their purpose was and could say it. And that was only a 23-year-old, actually. Everybody else, it takes a long time and you work on it. And even I can only say in the last 3 months, I can put mine into a sentence. And I've known roughly what direction it was for a long time, but I can now give one sentence that describes it. And that feels incredibly liberating because, for example, I got asked to write a book the other day, and instantly I didn't need to think about it. I was like, nope, doesn't meet my purpose. My ego would love it. It would feel great. I'd feel like, whoa, look at me. But it doesn't meet my purpose. It would be taking me away from doing what matters. And there's another lovely book I recommend all the time called Essentialism from Greg McKeown. And his is basically saying, when we say yes to all the requests we get, we are basically saying no to achieving our purpose, because we're not giving ourselves the space to figure out what we should be doing. We're following what everybody else wants us to do rather than doing what matters to us. And so it becomes a brilliant way, when you know your purpose, you get to say yes or no to things very, very quickly without having to go into all that questioning and that worry about whether you've turned something down that you shouldn't have.
And is that a private thing? Is when you find your purpose, when you can articulate that, is that something just for you, or is that something that you articulate to other people so they know what your purpose is?
A really powerful purpose involves others. I think the most powerful purposes involve others. So I can quite openly say mine is that I want to help VIPs, very intelligent perfectionists, become braver. That's what I do every day, and that's what I feel I was put on this earth to do. The interviewee in the book on purpose, hopefully lots of listeners will know him, is Damien Hall, the runner. And he is fascinating because he set out to run the Pennine Way and he wanted to set a new world record for doing so. And he did it with his purpose in mind. He had written down his arm in great big letters, FFF, family, friends, the future. And his purpose is about raising awareness of climate change. And so he only ate vegan food whilst he was running. It was all wrapped in compostable wrappers. His pacemakers picked up litter along the way. He didn't want anyone coming to support him unless they'd card shared to get there. He did everything with kind of lightness of touch in mind upon the earth on which he was running. His biggest rival that had set a record the week before, a guy called John Kelly, he spent the 2.5 days tweeting out all the stuff that Damien would normally tweet. So that whole new group of people got to see environmental messages. And Damien's goal was that when he'd done it, he'd get to go on BBC Breakfast and talk about it and raise awareness of climate change. And he did it. And he's since written a book about climate change, and he's used who he is and what he's achieved to do what matters to him. And so when you've been running nonstop for 2 days and everything hurts and all you want to do is curl up in a van and go to sleep, but your purpose is powerful enough that you know you have to keep on going, it's an incredible place to be.
That's amazing. And who of all the people that you and I know you've spoken to so many people for the book and in the work that you do, who inspires you? What can you think of? I mean, that story there was amazing, but can you think of another scenario where somebody has just blown you away with their inspiration?
Oh, this is a really cheesy one, but actually, it's my daughter. She gets really, really nervous about things. I can already see she's a perfectionist. And so she gets too scared to do something in case it's not perfect. And she did her first ballet show last summer. And my husband and I were in absolute pieces because we're like, I have no idea how she's going to go on stage. She's going to be way too terrified. There's no way she's going to do this. I'd given her every talk I've got on the sports psychology side, but I still didn't think it was going to work. And then she came on stage and we were both sobbing. It was so pathetic. But we were holding hands and we were sobbing just to see that she had overcome all of her fears and all of her worries to go up on stage in front of a whole theatre of people was just amazing. And so to see someone that you know better than anybody else in the world overcome some of their fears, I love. And she's not, I mean, I'm biased. She's no different to anybody else. She's not special in any way. We can all do everyday bravery. But to be able to spot that we're being brave in that moment and to celebrate that bravery, I think we should all be doing a lot more of that.
Oh, that's great. I love that. And I've got a young daughter as well who, those moments, I can really relate to those moments on stage at dance class and, the dance shows that they put on. That's great. You talked about bravery and you talked about everyday gratitude. Gratitude is one of the pillars as well, isn't it? And when times are tough and times are challenging, how do we find the space to be grateful for what's going on?
It's hard. One of the ways of doing it is making it a habit so that it just becomes automatic. I often work with people that are going through burnout and they're highly perfectionistic, very intelligent, can do everything, so they try. But obviously our bodies aren't designed that way. And at some point the body goes, yeah, not having that, and starts to shut down. And when you have burnout, it's not just your body that starts to really struggle. Mentally, you really struggle, and your relationships start to really, really struggle. You haven't got anything to give to those around you. And often a really nice task I will set is in bed at night, when you say goodnight to your partner, you both share a gratitude. And it can be tiny. It could be, I ate a nice cherry today. We're not going for deep and meaningfuls all the time, but we're trying to look for those moments of light on days that are really dark. Some days it might be a brilliant thing. I achieved this today, or I had a fabulous run, or I hit a new PB. But most of the time, they're going to be things that are pretty small. But we can always find something that is okay in a day. And asking other people, being prompted to kind of, oh yeah, what am I grateful for right now? It's a really nice thing to do. It's a lovely question to ask somebody, and it's a really nice kind of shared belonging moment that you can have.
Absolutely. You touched upon, you mentioned your daughter there and young people, and I kind of want to switch and just talk about your other book around young people's approach and relationship with positivity. The Teenage Athlete's Guide to Mental Fitness. Do you think there's more pressure on young people these days to perform, in sport or in life?
Yes, I'm really, really, really glad I'm old. Well, not old, but middle-aged. Like I grew up with, I don't think I got my first mobile till I was 16. I really feel for the pressure they have of constantly being on, of having everybody else's best lives shoved in their face over and over again, of not realizing how much of what goes on is impression management, of feeling like everybody else is achieving much more than they are. It's really, really hard. And I don't have a fix for it. What I do try and do with them is that brave work of, there are going to be fears, there are going to be worries. As you are going through your teenage years, your brain is changing, you're finding different things important that really, really matter to you, that I promise won't matter when you're 40, but we know they do now. So we're going to accept that those are tough times. We accept that you've got hormones all over the place, and it's much harder to control your emotions than it might be at other times in your life. But sometimes you're going to have to be really, really brave, and you will feel really, really good when you are. And we need to keep hold of those feelings when we are, so that you can cope with it.
And we're both parents, and I'm sure there's a lot of parents listening to this thinking about how they can equip their kids for this life, which, as you said, it feels like it's going to be very different to the one that we grew up living.
Yeah. Just as we talked about for motivation for doing brilliant in business or running, general motivation in life for feeling like we love what we do comes again down to those 3 pillars: a sense of belonging, finding your tribe. The young athletes that seem most lost are those that don't have their tribe. They either do a sport that's much, much smaller, so they haven't got lots of people around them, or they're at a certain school where other people don't get them. I think that's one of the lovely things if you go off to university. It tends to be a place you can find your people, and then you start to feel like you fit in. And that's why we can get kind of lonelier in adulthood, because it's harder to find those groups. But it is really, really important we find our tribe, we find people we bond with. The stats when I was researching around belonging, around loneliness, are incredible. Being lonely is the equivalent health-wise of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it's really, really important we find people we connect.
Yeah.
One of the things I will do with athletes if they have depression, something called an ACE. So every day you must achieve something, and it can be small, it can be a shower, it could be reading a couple of pages of a book, but you need to feel like you've achieved something. It's communication, communicating with somebody outside of your house. Could be sending a Snapchat, it could be a WhatsApp message, but having some engagement.